When we talk about healthy eating, most people think the conversation begins and ends with the contents of their plate. Protein, fats, carcros, intermittent fasting, superfoods. These are the external markers we tend to focus on. But what if I told you that the real starting point for healthy eating is not your diet, but your brain? That before we reach into the fridge or open the delivery app, something far more complex and foundational has already occurred in the nervous system. And if we ignore this internal process, no matter clean or disciplined your diet is, you're still reacting instead of truly choosing. You see, the decisions we make around food are the output of a deeply integrated neural network. One that involves the hypothalamus, the insula, the prefrontal cortex, and several powerful neurochemical systems. These systems don't just respond to physical hunger. They're influenced by stress, memory, environment, trauma, and even identity. In fact, the patterns that shape what we eat are often formed long we ever realize we have a relationship with food. And this is where things get interesting. Because whether someone struggles with restrictive eating, binge cycles, or seemingly unconscious snacking, it's not about food. It's about the patterns the brain has been trained to follow. Let's take a moment to look at one key chemical involved here, dopamine, often misunderstood as the pleasure molecule. Dopamine is more accurately the molecule of anticipation and motivation. It's the signal that something important is about to happen. When you smell fresh bread or see an ad for your favorite snack, your brain doesn't wait until you've eaten it to release dopamine. It starts firing in anticipation, driving you toward that food. This is where the first trap forms. We start associating food not with physical need, but with emotional relief, stress modulation, even entertainment. Over time, the reward circuitry in the brain became to seek out these hits of comfort or distraction. And just like with any other dopamine-triggering behavior, scrolling social media, shopping, gambling, our response becomes habitual and automatic. Now add in another layer, cortisol, the stress hormone. When cortisol is chronically elevated, as it is for many people due to modern lifestyle pressures, it distorts the signals that regulate hunger and fullness. Elevated cortisol can increase cravings for high-fat, high-sugar foods while simultaneously impairing the prefrontal cortex, our brain's command center responsible for executive function and impulse control. So not only do we crave comfort foods more under stress, but we're also less capable of resisting those cravings. This isn't a lack of willpower. It's a neurochemical imbalance. And when that imbalance is left unchecked for long enough, it forms a loop, a default mode the brain slips into without our conscious awareness. This is why, for someone struggling with anorexia, the restriction itself becomes rewarding. The absence of food begins to feel like a form of control, a source of identity, a strange kind of success. Their dopamine system begins to light up not from eating, but from denying. The brain adapts. It says, this is what gets rewarded now. Over time, hunger signals are suppressed, body cues are ignored, and the person becomes disconnected from their physiological needs. The same neuroplasticity that helps us build skills can also entrench dysfunction. On the other side, in bulimia or binge eating disorders, we see a different but equally powerful dysregulation. In these cases, food becomes the primary means of emotional regulation. The brain creates a shortcut emotional pain or eat a temporary relief. The relief is short-lived, often followed by shame or self-recrimination, which paradoxically triggers the same stress response that started that cycle in the first place. Again, this is not irrational. It's not a weakness. It's a learned pattern rooted in the very biology of how the brain seeks to protect from psychological pain. The brain doesn't care whether the strategy is healthy. It only cares whether it works in the short term. So the question becomes, how do we rewire this? First, we have to stop moralizing food. Food is not good or bad. It's data. It's information for the body. When we assign moral value to food, this is clean. That's a cheat meal. We inadvertently build emotional associations that extend far beyond nutrition. These associations begin to shape identity. We move from ate something unhealthy to I am unhealthy. That shift, subtle, is seismic. It transforms a single decision into a character trait. And once food becomes tied to self-worth, it's no longer about nourishment. It's about validation. Second, we must become aware of the antecedent moments. What happens in the seconds before you reach for that snack, before you decide to skip a meal, before the binge begins? These moments hold the key to rewiring, because every behavior is preceded by a cue, an emotion, a thought, a physical state. If we can identify that cue and interrupt the automaticity of the response, we begin to regain agency. This is where mindfulness, journaling, and even cognitive behavioral interventions become powerful. Not because they suppress the behavior, but because they bring it into conscious awareness. The goal is not to force change through discipline, but to build choice through understanding. Third, we need to support the brain's plasticity. Nutrition isn't just about calories. It's about neurochemistry. Omega-3 fatty acids, adequate protein, micronutrients like zinc and magnesium. All of these play a role in mood regulation, cognitive clarity, and impulse control. Sleep is equally critical. One night of poor sleep reduces activity in the prefrontal cortex and increases reactivity in the amygdala, making emotional regulation far more difficult the next day. Hydration, circadian alignment, light exposure, all of these elements create the conditions for a brain that can choose instead of merely react. And finally, we have to examine the narratives we carry. If someone has struggled with food for years, chances are they've internalized a story, I'm broken. I can't be trusted with food. All struggle. These stories are powerful, but they're also optional. And neuroscience is clear the stories we repeat shape the architecture of the brain. If we keep reinforcing the same internal monologue, the neural pathways become highways. But if we start introducing new language, I'm learning, I'm observing, I'm building new patterns, then the brain responds in kind. It starts laying new tracks. Over time, those new tracks become the default. This is not a quick fix. It's not a 30-day cleanse or a bulletproof biohack. It's a long, sometimes difficult, but deeply worthwhile process of reclaiming the relationship between the brain, the body, and food. It requires us to be both scientists and subjects, observing without judgment, experimenting with curiosity, and allowing space for adaptation. It's the process of moving from unconscious reaction to conscious creation. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's these healthy eating doesn't start with your diet. It starts with your nervous system. Until you understand the forces driving your decisions, the neurochemistry, the emotional cues, the identity structures, you're just playing defense. But once you bring those forces into awareness, you can begin to steer. You can move from survival mode into strategic mode. You can build a way of eating that is not routed in fear, shame, or control, but in alignment, awareness, and trust. Because in the end, food is not the enemy. Your brain isn't sabotaging you. It's trying to protect you with the best tools it has. And now you have better tools. Use them. When someone struggles with an eating disorder, whether it's anorexia, bulimia, or binge eating, the most damaging aspect isn't always the behavior itself. Yes, the physical toll on the body is significant. Yes, the nutritional consequences are real. But the deeper, more enduring damage often takes place not in the body, but in the mind, specifically in identity. Because over time, what begins as a behavior, restricting, purging, binging, morphs into something more fundamental. It becomes who the person believes they are. And that shift is dangerous. When a person begins to internalize their disorder as part of their identity, they no longer see it as something separate, something they're experiencing or navigating. They start to believe it is them. I'm anorexic. I'm a binge eater. I'm broken. Those words become the story, and the story becomes the architecture of self. And once a behavior fuses with identity, it becomes infinitely harder to change. Because at that point, letting go of the disorder feels like letting go of yourself. But here's the true thing, that identity is a false one. It's not the real self. It's a mask that was adopted to survive something painful, something unspoken, something unresolved. Eating disorders don't emerge out of nowhere. They are, at their core, adaptations. Often intelligent, if maladaptive, strategies to manage overwhelm, trauma, costs, or a desperate need for control. And when we fail to address those root causes, we end up treating the symptom and reinforcing the false identity that grew around it. Now, here's where neuroscience gives us hope. Identity, contrary to what many people believe, is not fixed. It is plastic, just like the brain itself. The circuits that make up who we believe we are, what we're capable of, what we're allowed to feel, how much space we think we deserve. Those circuits are built over time. They're shaped by repetition, by reinforcement, by environment. And the good news is that anything built can also be rebuilt. But before that rebuilding can occur, there has to be awareness. And that begins with asking a simple but profound question. Where did this identity come from? Because no child is born thinking they need to control food to be worthy. No one enters the world believing their value is tied to a number on a scale. These are ideas that were taught, directly or indirectly, consciously or unconsciously. Maybe it was a comment from a parent. Maybe it was a cultural ideal. Maybe it was a survival mechanism during a time when everything else felt out of control. Whatever the origin, the point is that it was learned. And if it was learned, it can be unlearned. We have to dismantle the lie that control equals worth. That perfection in eating habits equates to perfection in life. That by micromanaging calories or engaging in cycles of punishment and reward, we're somehow gaining power. What we're actually doing is outsourcing our sense of self to a set of behaviors that will never love us back. No amount of dietary discipline, no level of leanness, no controlled eating pattern will ever substitute for true self-understanding. Because food is not a replacement for identity, it's fuel. And when we confuse those two, we lose sight of what actually makes us human. Let's take a closer look at how the brain locks this in. The insula, an area involved in interoception, or the sense of internal body signals, plays a key role in how people with eating disorders perceive hunger, fullness, and even body image. When this region is dysregulated, the individual literally misreads signals from the body. They don't feel full, or they perceive fullness as distress. They don't experience hunger in the same way, or they associate it with accomplishment. These perceptions aren't imagined. They're real, encoded in the brain's functioning. And the more a person repeats the behaviors, restricting, binging, purging, the more those patterns are reinforced neurologically. Identity then isn't just a belief. It becomes embodied, felt, reinforced not only by thought, but by sensation. That's why saying, just eat, or just stop purging, doesn't work. Because the nervous system has linked survival to those actions. The body feels safe in the ritual, even if the mind knows it's destructive. That's the paradox of eating disorders. They're both prison and protector. So how do we begin to rewire identity? It starts with naming, separating you from the behavior. I'm not my disorder. I am someone experiencing anorexia. That small shift in language opens a psychological gap, a space where choice can exist. When you stop saying, this is who I am, and start saying, this is something I've learned, the brain has an opportunity to reorganize. You introduce a wedge between self and symptom, and that wedge is where healing begins. From there, you can begin to rebuild. Not by trying to become someone new, but by returning to someone true, someone who existed before the identity was shaped by pain. This isn't a regression, it's a reintegration. It's the process of remembering who you were before food became a battleground, before the mirror became a measure of value, before your worth was hijacked by numbers and rituals and silence. This reconstruction is supported not just by psychology but by biology. The more you act in alignment with your emerging identity, the more your brain adapts to support it. That's neuroplasticity in motion. Each time you make a different choice, eat a meal without compensation, respond to distress without numbing, speak truth instead of hiding, you're building a new map, a new network, a new self. And this is where the philosophical depth becomes important. Because recovery isn't just about eating more or purging less. It's about asking, who am I if I'm not this? What do I stand for if not control? Where do I belong if not in the prison I've known? These are existential questions, and they deserve existential answers. Answers grounded in compassion, science, and self-awareness. We also have to talk about community. Identity is never formed in isolation, and healing doesn't happen in a vacuum. We are social creatures. Our nervous systems co-regulate with those around us. That means being seen, heard, and understood is not a luxury. It's a biological necessity. If your environment continues to reinforce the old identity, through diet culture, toxic social dynamics, or shaming narratives, then no amount of individual effort will suffice. You need mirrors that reflect the truth of who you're becoming, not the shadows of who you were. That's why therapy, support groups, honest friendships, and even educational tools like this are vital. They give the brain new input. They offer new patterns. They help build a scaffold for a more resilient identity, one not built on control, but on connection, and perhaps most critically, we need to extend patience. This process is not linear. There will be regressions. There will be moments when the old identity pulls harder than the new one. That's normal. It's not failure. It's the nervous system doing what it was trained to do. But if you can stay in relationship with yourself through those moments, if you can pause, observe, and re-anchor, you're still on the path. Every decision to return to awareness is a vote for the future self you're building. In the end, healing from an eating disorder is not about becoming perfect. It's not even about returning to some normal state. It's about reclaiming authorship. Reclaiming the right to your own story, separate from food, separate from numbers, separate from shame. It's about looking at the old identity, not with hate or fear, but with gratitude. Because it helped you survive. It kept you here. But now, it's time for something more. And because the real you, the one beneath the disorder, is not fragile. It's not broken. It's been Weight Watching, gathering strength. And now, with insight, support, and conscious practice, that self can emerge. Not because the old self was bad, but because the new one is built on truth. And truth heals what shame hides. So the next time you find yourself slipping into that old voice, the one that says, I am this disorder. This is who I'll always be. Pause. Take a breath and say instead, that's who I was. But it's not who I am now. Then act like it, even if it's hard. Especially if it's hard, because that's how identity shifts. That's how you come home to yourself.